The helicopter blades chopped through the thin mountain air as Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen pressed his face against the small window. Below them stretched the rugged landscape of Afghanistan's eastern provinces, a maze of rocky valleys and steep ridges that had swallowed countless soldiers over the decades. The UH-60 Black Hawk carried 8 Navy SEALs on what should have been a routine extraction mission. But Marcus had learned long ago that nothing in this war-torn country ever went according to plan. Team leader Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat across from Marcus, his weathered face studying a tablet displaying their mission coordinates. The intel was straightforward. Retrieve a high-value target from a compound nestled in a valley 3 clicks from the Pakistani border. The target was supposedly a Taliban commander who had been orchestrating attacks on supply convoys for months. Simple enough, except for the terrain that made vehicle access impossible and the fact that they were operating in one of the most hostile regions in the country. Petty Officer First Class Diego Ramirez checked his rifle for the 3rd time, a nervous habit that had kept him alive through 2 deployments. Next to him, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Sarah Mitchell reviewed her medical supplies, her calm demeanor masking the tension that gripped every member of the team. The remaining 4 SEALs, Thompson, Williams, Jackson, and Rookie Rodriguez, sat in focused silence, each lost in their own pre-mission rituals. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. 5 minutes to insertion point. Weather's deteriorating fast, so we need to make this quick. Marcus glanced outside again and noticed the clouds gathering around the mountain peaks. The monsoon season was approaching, and these mountains were notorious for sudden, violent storms that could strand aircraft and ground troops for days. Lieutenant Morrison stood and addressed his team. Remember, we go in fast and quiet. Intelligence suggests minimal resistance, but we all know how reliable that's been lately. Rodriguez, stay close to Mitchell. Thompson and Williams, you're on overwatch. The rest of us move on the compound. Extraction is scheduled for 0400, giving us 6 hours to complete the mission and reach the landing zone. The helicopter began its descent toward a small clearing carved into the mountainside. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the aircraft suddenly lurched to one side, the pilot fighting against increasing wind gusts. Through his headset, he heard the co-pilot reporting wind speeds that were approaching the maximum safe operating limits for their aircraft. As they touched down, the team quickly disembarked, their boots hitting the rocky ground with practiced precision. The helicopter's engines remained running, rotors spinning as the crew chief signaled their departure time. Lieutenant Morrison gave a thumbs up, and the Black Hawk lifted off into the darkening sky, leaving the 8 SEALs alone in the wilderness. The silence that followed was almost deafening after hours of engine noise. Marcus adjusted his night vision goggles and took in their surroundings. They had landed on a narrow ledge about halfway up a steep valley wall. Below them, the target compound was barely visible through the darkness, a cluster of mud brick buildings that seemed to grow from the rocky landscape itself. Corpsman Mitchell checked her radio equipment while Thompson and Williams moved to establish their overwatch positions on higher ground. The plan was straightforward. Approach the compound under cover of darkness, secure the target, and make their way to extraction point 2 kilometers away, where the helicopter would pick them up at dawn. But as they began their descent toward the valley floor, Rodriguez suddenly held up his hand, signaling the team to stop. The young SEAL had exceptional hearing, a skill that had earned him a place on the team despite his limited experience. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of vehicles moving through the valley. Lieutenant Morrison used hand signals to position his team behind a cluster of boulders. Through his scope, Marcus could see headlights winding their way up the narrow mountain road toward the compound. 3 vehicles, maybe 4, carrying an unknown number of fighters. This wasn't part of the intelligence briefing, Ramirez whispered into his radio, trying to reach their command center to report the unexpected development. Static filled his earpiece. The mountains were notorious for disrupting communications, and the approaching storm was making conditions even worse. They were on their own until they could reach higher ground or wait for the scheduled check-in time in 4 hours. The vehicles stopped near the compound, and figures began moving in the darkness. Marcus counted at least 12 individuals, all carrying rifles. The simple snatch-and-grab mission was rapidly becoming something much more complicated. Lieutenant Morrison gathered his team for a quick conference, their voices barely above a whisper. "We stick to the mission," he decided. But we wait for these new arrivals to settle in before we make our move. Thompson, Williams, can you get eyes on the compound from your position? Thompson's voice came through their earpieces. Affirmative. Looks like they're setting up some kind of perimeter. This might be a meeting, not just a safe house. The SEALs settled in to wait, knowing that patience was often the difference between success and disaster in their line of work. Marcus checked his watch, 2300 hours. They had time, but the weather was getting worse. The wind was picking up and he could feel the first drops of rain on his face. As they watched the compound, it became clear that something significant was happening. More vehicles arrived over the next hour, and the number of armed fighters grew to nearly 30. Whatever intelligence had led them to this location, it was either outdated or incomplete. They weren't just dealing with a single target anymore. The rain began in earnest as midnight approached, turning the rocky ground slippery and reducing visibility even with their advanced night vision equipment. Corpsman Mitchell worked to protect her medical supplies and radio equipment from the moisture. While the rest of the team checked their weapons and gear, Lieutenant Morrison made the decision that would change everything. They would proceed with the mission despite the increased enemy presence. The target was too valuable to abandon, and they had trained for situations exactly like this. What none of them could have predicted was that by dawn, they would be fighting not just for their mission's success, but for their very survival, trapped in a valley with no way out except through the enemy forces that surrounded them. The rain turned into a torrential downpour as the SEALs began their approach to the compound at 0200 hours. Marcus felt the water soaking through his gear despite the weather-resistant materials, and every step on the slick rocks required careful attention to avoid a potentially fatal slip. The mission had already deviated significantly from their original plan, but Lieutenant Morrison was determined to adapt and overcome. Thompson and Williams maintained their overwatch positions on the ridge above, providing the team with critical intelligence about enemy movements. Through the rain and darkness, they reported guards stationed at regular intervals around the compound, far more security than intelligence had suggested they would encounter. The presence of additional vehicles and personnel indicated this was either a high-level meeting or a trap that had been set specifically for American forces. Rodriguez struggled with the treacherous terrain, his inexperience showing as he slipped twice on the wet rocks. Ramirez moved closer to provide support, remembering his own first deployment and the overwhelming nature of real combat operations. The rookie's breathing was rapid and shallow, classic signs of pre-combat stress that could compromise the entire mission if not managed properly. Corpsman Mitchell noticed Rodriguez's condition and used hand signals to communicate with Lieutenant Morrison. During a brief halt behind a rock outcropping, she administered a mild sedative that would calm his nerves without impairing his reflexes. The young SEAL nodded gratefully, understanding that his team was looking out for him even in the middle of enemy territory. As they moved closer to the compound, the sounds of conversation and movement became more distinct. Marcus could hear voices speaking in Pashto and Arabic, suggesting that this gathering included fighters from multiple regions and possibly foreign elements. The intelligence value of whatever was happening inside those buildings had increased dramatically, but so had the risk to his team. Lieutenant Morrison called another halt 50 meters from the compound's outer perimeter. Using his night vision scope, he studied the building layout and guard positions. The original target was supposed to be in the central building, but the increased security made it impossible to determine which structure actually housed their objective. They would need to get closer and possibly conduct a more extensive search than originally planned. The storm continued to intensify, with lightning beginning to illuminate the valley in brief, stark flashes, while the noise and reduced visibility provided some cover for their approach. It also made communication more difficult and increased the risk of being caught in the open if the weather systems produced more severe conditions. Jackson, the team's demolitions expert, identified several potential entry points into the compound. The mud brick walls were thick but showed signs of age and weathering that could be exploited. However, any breach would need to be silent to avoid, alerting the guards and the unknown number of fighters inside the buildings. Ramirez established communication with their Overwatch team and received an updated count of enemy personnel. Thompson reported at least 40 individuals now present at the compound, including several who appeared to be senior leaders based on their behavior and the deference shown by other fighters. This was definitely not a routine safe house operation. The decision point had arrived. Lieutenant Morrison could abort the mission and try to reach the extraction point without engaging the enemy, but the intelligence value of the gathering made that option increasingly difficult to justify. On the other hand, proceeding with the mission against such overwhelming odds violated basic principles of special operations warfare. Mitchell voiced what everyone was thinking. "Sir, we're looking at odds of 5 to 1, maybe worse. Even if we succeed in grabbing the target, getting out alive is going to be nearly impossible with this many hostiles in the area." Morrison weighed the options while lightning continued to flash overhead. The original extraction point was 2 kilometers away through terrain that would be extremely dangerous in current weather conditions, but more importantly, the helicopter might not be able to operate safely in the storm that was developing around them. "Rodriguez, try to raise command on the satellite radio," Morrison ordered. "We need to report the situation and get updated extraction options." The rookie SEAL worked frantically with the radio equipment, but atmospheric interference from the storm made communication impossible. They were completely on their own until the weather cleared. Marcus suggested a modified approach to the mission. Instead of a direct assault on the compound, they could position themselves to observe and gather intelligence about the meeting, then attempt to follow the target when he left. This would reduce the immediate risk while still accomplishing their primary objective of locating and identifying the Taliban commander. The plan had merit, but it also required them to remain in the area much longer than originally intended, increasing their exposure to enemy patrols and the deteriorating weather conditions. As if to emphasize the point, another flash of lightning revealed their position momentarily, causing everyone to freeze until darkness returned. Thompson's voice crackled through their earpieces with urgent news. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like another convoy, maybe 6 or 7 trucks. This place is turning into a major gathering." The situation was spiraling beyond anything they had trained for. What had been planned as a simple extraction mission was becoming a complex intelligence operation in the middle of what appeared to be a significant Taliban leadership meeting. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential value of the intelligence they could gather. Lieutenant Morrison made the decision that would trap them in the valley for the next 18 hours. "We're staying. This is too big to walk away from. But we're changing tactics. We observe, we gather intelligence, and we look for an opportunity to grab our target when he's isolated from the main group." As the new convoy of vehicles wound its way up the mountain road toward the compound, the 8 SEALs settled into positions that would allow them to monitor the situation throughout the night. None of them realized that by morning, the weather would clear to reveal their presence to enemy forces, beginning a desperate fight for survival that would test every skill they had learned and push them beyond the limits of human endurance. The storm raged on as more fighters arrived at the compound, and Marcus began to understand that they had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Dawn broke with deceptive beauty over the Afghan mountains, the storm having passed during the early morning hours. Marcus watched the sun climb over the eastern peaks, casting long shadows across the valley floor where the compound sat like a hornet's nest of activity. The clear skies that should have been a relief instead filled him with dread, because it meant their helicopter extraction was now possible, but it also meant enemy forces could spot their positions much more easily. Throughout the night, the SEALs had maintained their observation posts around the compound, documenting the arrival of what appeared to be a major Taliban leadership conference. Mitchell had counted over 60 fighters and at least 15 vehicles, transforming their simple extraction mission into surveillance of what could be the largest gathering of enemy commanders in months. Lieutenant Morrison attempted radio contact with their command center as soon as atmospheric conditions improved. The response he received changed everything about their situation. Due to intelligence gathered from their overnight observations, higher command was ordering them to maintain surveillance and gather as much information as possible about the meeting participants. Their extraction had been postponed indefinitely. "Sir, that's not what we signed up for," Ramirez whispered during a brief team conference. "We've got enough firepower for a quick hit, but not for extended operations against this many hostiles. Plus, our water and ammo won't last more than another day or two." Thompson's voice came through their earpieces from his overwatch position. "Movement at the compound. Looks like they're preparing for some kind of ceremony or meeting. There's a lot of activity in the central courtyard. Through his scope, Marcus could see figures arranging chairs and setting up what appeared to be communication equipment. Several individuals wearing distinctive clothing that suggested senior leadership positions were moving between buildings, accompanied by armed guards who showed them obvious respect and deference. The rookie Rodriguez had performed well during the night, overcoming his initial nervousness to provide valuable intelligence about guard rotations and movement patterns around the compound. His young eyes had spotted details that the more experienced team members had missed, proving his worth to the unit despite his limited combat experience. Jackson identified their original target moving between buildings mid-morning. The Taliban commander they had come to capture was indeed present, but he was accompanied by at least 8 bodyguards and appeared to be playing host to the other senior leaders. Any attempt to isolate and capture him would be suicide given the current circumstances. As the morning progressed, the SEALs realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Intelligence intercepts suggested this was a gathering of Taliban leadership from across 3 provinces, possibly planning coordinated attacks against NATO forces. The strategic value of the information they were collecting was immense, but their tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Williams reported movement on the ridgelines around the valley that suggested enemy security forces were expanding their perimeter. We've got patrol teams moving up the slopes about a kilometer out. They're setting up a wider security zone around the compound. The implications were clear. The SEALs were being systematically surrounded by enemy forces who were establishing defensive positions that would make escape nearly impossible. What had begun as a simple mission was becoming a trap, with no obvious way out. Mitchell worked to stretch their limited supplies while maintaining her medical readiness for potential casualties. The team carried enough water for 3 days and ammunition for 1 sustained firefight. But their current situation suggested they might need to survive much longer while facing multiple engagements with numerically superior forces. Lieutenant Morrison faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Command was demanding continued surveillance of the leadership meeting, but his responsibility to his team required him to consider their survival above the mission objectives. The weather had cleared enough for helicopter operations, but any extraction attempt would expose the aircraft to ground fire from the increasing number of fighters in the Asir area. The Taliban commander they had originally come to capture emerged from the central building, accompanied by 2 other individuals who appeared to be foreign fighters, possibly Al-Qaeda operatives based on their dress and behavior. The intelligence value of identifying these individuals was enormous, but photographing them required the SEALs to remain in their exposed positions. Rodriguez managed to capture detailed images of the meeting, participants using a high-powered camera equipped with telephoto lens capabilities. The photographs would provide intelligence analysts with unprecedented insight into Taliban leadership structure and foreign fighter involvement in the region, assuming the team survived long enough to transmit the images. As noon approached, the number of armed fighters around the compound had swelled to nearly 100. Vehicle-mounted heavy weapons were being positioned at strategic points, and communication antennas were being erected that would allow the Taliban to coordinate with other units across the region. Marcus realized that they had stumbled into the planning phase of what could be a major offensive against coalition forces. The intelligence they were gathering was critical to preventing potentially catastrophic attacks, but each hour they remained in position increased the likelihood of discovery and death. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley around midday, causing both hope and terror among the SEAL team. The aircraft was too far away to identify, but its presence over the area would definitely alert enemy forces to the possibility of coalition special operations in the vicinity. All stations. This is Overwatch 2, Williams reported. I've got eyes on the helicopter. It's one of ours, but it's being fired on by ground forces near the compound. The bird is taking evasive action and moving away from the area. The helicopter's appearance had triggered a massive response from Taliban forces throughout the valley. Machine gun positions that had been hidden during the night were now revealed as fighters opened fire on the aircraft. The SEALs counted at least 12 heavy weapon positions that they had not previously identified. Lieutenant Morrison's radio crackled with an emergency transmission from command. Romeo team, Be advised that extraction is not possible at this time due to heavy ground fire. Maintain your positions and continue surveillance. We're working on alternative extraction options. The message confirmed Marcus's worst fears. They were officially stranded behind enemy lines with no immediate prospect of rescue. The Taliban leadership meeting was continuing as planned, but the helicopter's appearance had placed all enemy forces in the area on high alert. Any movement by the SEAL team would now risk immediate discovery and engagement with overwhelming enemy forces. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky positions where the 8 SEALs lay hidden. Their ghillie suits providing camouflage but little relief from the heat that reflected off the stone surfaces around them. Marcus felt sweat running down his back as he maintained his observation of the compound through his scope, watching as the Taliban leadership meeting entered what appeared to be its most critical phase. Rodriguez had been monitoring radio frequencies throughout the day, picking up fragments of communication that suggested the enemy was aware of foreign forces in the area. The helicopter incident at midday had triggered a massive security response, with search teams now systematically sweeping the valley walls where the SEALs were hidden. "Contact left," Thompson whispered urgently through the team radio. "I've got a patrol moving up the slope about 300 meters from my position. 4 fighters fully armed moving in our direction." Lieutenant Morrison's mind raced through their limited options. They could engage the patrol and risk revealing their positions to the entire enemy force, or they could attempt to evade and hope the Taliban fighters passed by without detecting their presence. Either choice carried potentially fatal consequences for his team. Mitchell pressed herself flat against the rocks as voices became audible below their position. The enemy patrol was moving methodically through the terrain, checking behind boulders and in crevices where someone might hide. Their systematic approach suggested they had received specific intelligence about possible coalition forces in the area. Jackson slowly moved his hand toward his sidearm as footsteps approached his concealment position. Through the gaps in the rocks, he could see the boots of Taliban fighters passing within arm's reach of his hiding spot. His breathing became shallow and controlled as he prepared for the possibility of close-quarters combat that would doom the entire mission. The patrol passed by without detecting the hidden SEALs, but their presence confirmed that enemy forces were actively searching for coalition troops. Williams reported similar patrol activity on the opposite side of the valley, indicating a coordinated effort to sweep the entire area for foreign fighters. As evening approached, the Taliban leadership meeting showed no signs of concluding. In fact, the level of activity around the compound had increased, with additional security teams arriving and establishing defensive positions throughout the valley. The SEALs were not only trapped by the terrain and weather conditions, but now by an expanding network of enemy forces that made movement increasingly impossible. Ramirez worked frantically to establish communication with their command center, finally achieving intermittent contact as atmospheric conditions improved with the setting sun. The message he received was not encouraging. Extraction remained impossible due to the heavy concentration of enemy forces in the area, and the team was ordered to continue surveillance until the situation changed. "Sir, we're down to less than 2 days of water, and maybe enough ammunition for one significant engagement," Mitchell reported during their evening team conference. "If we don't get extracted soon, we're going to be in serious trouble even without enemy contact." Lieutenant Morrison understood the gravity of their situation better than anyone. His team was stranded in hostile territory with limited supplies, facing an enemy force that outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. The intelligence they were gathering was invaluable, but the cost of obtaining it might be the lives of 8 highly trained special operations personnel. The compound below came alive with activity as darkness fell. Generators powered floodlights that illuminated the central courtyard where the Taliban leaders had gathered for what appeared to be a major presentation. Through his night vision scope, Marcus could see dozens of fighters arranged in formation while senior commanders addressed the group. Rodriguez managed to capture audio recordings of portions of the meeting using sophisticated listening equipment, though the distance and background noise made much of the conversation difficult to understand. What was clear was that they were witnessing the planning of a major operation that would likely result in significant coalition casualties if allowed to proceed. Jackson identified several target packages that could be engaged with. Precision strikes if aircraft were available, but the enemy's surface-to-air capabilities made air support extremely risky. The Taliban had positioned multiple anti-aircraft weapons throughout the valley, including systems that had not been identified by previous intelligence-gathering efforts. As midnight approached, the meeting in the compound appeared to be reaching some kind of conclusion. Senior leaders began departing in small groups, their vehicles moving out under heavy escort toward different mountain roads. The dispersal of the leadership elements meant that any military response would need to be immediate to prevent the loss of critical targets. Thompson reported increased patrol activity on the ridges around their position. I count at least 6 different teams moving through the area. They're definitely looking for something, and they're getting more aggressive in their search patterns. The enemy search teams were equipped with night vision equipment and thermal imaging devices, technology that had not been expected based on previous intelligence assessments. The SEALs' concealment was adequate against visual observation, but thermal detection could reveal their body heat signatures despite their camouflage efforts. Williams whispered urgently into his radio. "I've got movement directly below my position. Looks like they're setting up some kind of observation post about 50 meters down the slope. If they establish a permanent position there, they'll have a clear view of my location." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces were not only searching for the SEALs but were establishing positions that would make continued concealment impossible. Lieutenant Morrison realized that they were approaching a point where engagement would become unavoidable. Despite the overwhelming odds they faced, Mitchell began preparing for the possibility of treating combat casualties, organizing her medical supplies for rapid access during potential firefight conditions. Her training as a combat medic had prepared her for battlefield medicine, but the isolated nature of their position meant that any serious injuries would be extremely difficult to treat effectively. Rodriguez discovered that his radio equipment was picking up communications from the enemy search teams, revealing that they were following a systematic grid pattern that would eventually uncover the SEALs' positions. The young SEAL's technical skills were proving invaluable, but the intelligence he was gathering painted an increasingly desperate picture of their situation. As dawn approached on their second day in the valley, Marcus realized that their period of passive observation was coming to an end. The enemy search pattern would reach their positions within hours, forcing them into combat whether they wanted it or not. The question was no longer if they would be discovered, but whether they would survive the engagement that was about to begin. The second dawn in the valley brought with it the sound Marcus had been dreading, voices speaking in hushed Pashto getting closer to their concealed positions. The enemy search teams had spent the night systematically working their way up the valley walls, and their methodical approach was about to expose the hidden SEAL team. Despite their expert camouflage and Fieldcraft, Lieutenant Morrison made the hand signal that every member of his team had been expecting but hoping to avoid. Prepare for contact. 8 sets of hands moved silently to weapons as the SEALs readied themselves for what would likely be their final engagement. The odds were impossible, but they were determined to make the enemy pay dearly for their discovery. Rodriguez pressed himself deeper into his rocky hiding place as footsteps approached his position. Through a gap in the stones, he could see the legs of Taliban fighters moving carefully through the terrain, checking every potential hiding spot with the patience of experienced hunters. His heart pounded as he realized that discovery was now inevitable. The first contact came from Thompson's position on the high ground. A Taliban fighter spotted something unusual about the rocks where the SEAL sniper was concealed and moved closer to investigate. Thompson waited until the last possible moment before engaging, his suppressed rifle making barely a whisper as the enemy fighter dropped silently to the ground. But the damage was done. The dead fighter's radio crackled with inquiries about his status, and when no response came, alarm calls echoed through the valley as other search teams converged on Thompson's position. The period of hidden observation was over. They were now in a fight for their lives. Marcus opened fire on 3 Taliban fighters who were climbing toward his position, his accurate shooting dropping 2 of them before the third could find cover. The sound of unsuppressed gunfire echoed through the valley, alerting every enemy force in the area to the presence of coalition troops and their general location. Ramirez found himself under attack from multiple directions as enemy fighters who had been searching the area below his position suddenly turned their weapons upward toward the muzzle flashes from his rifle. His training took over as he moved from cover to cover, engaging targets while trying to avoid the increasing volume of return fire. Jackson used his demolitions expertise to improvise defensive obstacles, triggering small explosive charges that created rock slides to block enemy approach routes. The terrain that had hidden the SEALs was now working in their favor, forcing the attacking Taliban fighters to approach through predictable channels where they could be engaged more effectively. Williams coordinated the team's defensive fire from his position, identifying priority targets and calling out enemy movements to his teammates. His experience as a veteran of multiple deployments showed as he managed to maintain tactical awareness despite the chaos of combat and the overwhelming number of enemy fighters closing in on their positions. Mitchell moved between team members, treating a grazing wound that Rodriguez had sustained during the initial exchange of gunfire. Working under fire was nothing new for the combat medic, but the isolated nature of their position and the intensity of the enemy response made her job particularly challenging as bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them. Lieutenant Morrison realized that their defensive positions, while well concealed, were becoming death traps as enemy fighters moved to surround them on the rocky slopes. The time for hiding was over. They needed to move to more defensible terrain or risk being overrun by sheer numbers. "We need to consolidate positions," he called out during a brief lull in the firing. "Move to the ridgeline where we can establish overlapping fields of fire. We can't stay separated like this." The movement to higher ground required the SEALs to expose themselves to enemy fire, but staying in their individual hiding places would allow the Taliban to defeat them one by one. Thompson provided covering fire as his teammates began leapfrogging up the slope toward a more defensible position near the top of the ridge. Enemy reinforcements were arriving from the compound below, including fighters with crew-served weapons that could provide sustained fire against the SEALs' positions. The sound of heavy machine guns echoed through the valley as Taliban forces established firing positions that commanded the slopes where the Americans were fighting. Rodriguez proved his worth during the movement, using his technical skills to coordinate radio calls for fire support while simultaneously engaging enemy targets with his rifle. The young SEAL had overcome his initial nervousness and was now fighting with the skill and determination of a seasoned warrior. The consolidation to the ridgeline was successful, but it also revealed the full extent of their tactical situation. Marcus counted at least 50 enemy fighters moving up the slopes toward their position, with more arriving from the valley floor. Vehicle-mounted weapons were being positioned to provide direct fire support, and the sound of additional vehicles suggested that even more reinforcements were en route. Jackson prepared his remaining explosive devices for final defensive use, setting up improvised claymore mines that would help channel enemy attacks into kill zones, where the SEALs could engage them more effectively. His demolitions work was buying them time, but ammunition was running low and the enemy seemed to have unlimited numbers. Williams established communication with their overwatch positions and began calling in the GPS coordinates of enemy positions to any aircraft that might be available for close air support. The response he received was discouraging. No friendly aircraft were available due to the heavy concentration of anti-aircraft weapons in the valley. As the morning sun climbed higher, the intensity of the firefight increased. Taliban fighters were now moving in coordinated teams, using covering fire and tactical movement that suggested they were receiving direction from experienced military commanders. This was not the rabble of untrained insurgents that intelligence had suggested they would encounter. Lieutenant Morrison's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission from an unknown call sign. "Romeo team, this is Ridge Runner. We've been monitoring your situation. Help is coming, but you need to hold your position for another 30 minutes. The message provided a glimmer of hope, but 30 minutes seemed like an eternity when facing such overwhelming odds. Marcus checked his ammunition and realized he was down to his last 2 magazines. Around him, his teammates were in similar situations, their carefully rationed supplies nearly exhausted after hours of continuous combat. The ridgeline position that had seemed like salvation was becoming their last stand, and the enemy forces showed no signs of diminishing their attacks despite heavy casualties from the SEALs' accurate defensive fire. The 30 minutes promised by the mysterious Ridge Runner call sign stretched into what felt like hours as the 8 SEALs fought desperately to hold their position on the rocky ridgeline. Marcus was down to his final magazine when the sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from an unexpected direction. not from the valley below, but from the ridgeline above their position. Through the haze of gun smoke and dust, figures in American military gear appeared along the high ground, their weapons trained on the Taliban forces that had been closing in on the trapped SEAL team. The newcomers moved with the precision and coordination of experienced special operations personnel, engaging enemy targets with devastating accuracy. "Romeo team, this is Ridge Runner Actual," came the voice over the radio. "We're U.S. Rangers, and we've been tracking your situation for the past 6 hours. Maintain your positions while we clear the immediate area." Lieutenant Morrison felt a surge of relief as he realized that help had indeed arrived, though he wondered how American forces had managed to reach their isolated position without being detected by the extensive Taliban security network throughout the valley. The answer came as additional gunfire erupted from multiple directions around the enemy compound. The Rangers had not come alone. A coordinated operation involving multiple special operations teams was unfolding across the entire valley, with American forces engaging Taliban positions simultaneously from several directions. The enemy leadership meeting that had trapped the SEALs had also provided an opportunity for a major strike against Taliban command structure. Rodriguez worked frantically with his communications equipment to coordinate with the Ranger unit while maintaining contact with the other members of his SEAL team. The technical skills that had made him valuable during their surveillance mission were now crucial for managing the complex tactical situation as friendly forces maneuvered around their position. Thompson, from his sniper position, began engaging Taliban fighters who were trying to escape the valley as the coordinated American assault intensified. His precision shooting was helping to prevent enemy leaders from fleeing the area, supporting the broader objective of disrupting Taliban command and control capabilities. Jackson used his remaining explosive devices to block enemy escape routes, creating obstacles that channeled fleeing Taliban fighters into areas where they could be engaged by American forces. His demolitions expertise was proving valuable not just for defensive purposes but for controlling enemy movement across the battlefield. Williams coordinated between the SEAL team and the arriving Ranger forces, helping to prevent friendly fire incidents as multiple American units operated in close proximity. His experience with joint operations was essential for managing the complex tactical environment that had developed in the valley. Mitchell continued treating wounded team members while preparing to assist with casualties from the Ranger unit if needed. The combat medic skills were in high demand as the intensity of the firefight increased with the arrival of additional American forces throughout the area. As the battle raged around them, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what was happening. The intelligence they had gathered during their 2 days of surveillance had enabled a major special operations strike against Taliban leadership. Their sacrifice and dedication to the mission had provided the targeting information necessary for a coordinated assault that was dealing a significant blow to enemy capabilities in the region. The compound below was now under direct assault by what appeared to be a company-sized element of American Special Operations Forces. Explosions echoed through the valley as buildings were systematically cleared and high-value targets were either captured or eliminated. Ramirez provided covering fire for a Ranger team that was moving to secure the ridgeline approach to their position. The coordination between the two special operations units was seamless, demonstrating the effectiveness of joint training and shared tactical procedures that allowed different American forces to work together efficiently. The Taliban commander who had been their original target was spotted, attempting to flee the compound in a vehicle convoy. Thompson's long-range shooting disabled the lead vehicle, causing the convoy to halt where it could be engaged by other American forces. The mission objective that had seemed impossible to achieve was now within reach. Major Sarah Peterson, the Ranger Company commander, reached the SEAL team's position as the firefight began to subside. "Your intelligence made this entire operation possible," she told Lieutenant Morrison. "The surveillance data you collected allowed us to identify and target the entire Taliban leadership network in this region." The coordinated assault had been a complete success. With over 40 high-value targets captured or eliminated during the operation, the Taliban leadership meeting that had trapped the SEALs had inadvertently provided American forces with an unprecedented opportunity to disrupt enemy command structure across 3 provinces as helicopters arrived to extract both the SEAL team and the Ranger forces. Marcus realized that their 2 days of desperate survival had contributed to one of the most successful special operations missions of the war. The intelligence they had gathered while stranded behind enemy lines had enabled a strike that would significantly degrade Taliban capabilities for months to come. Rodriguez had overcome his rookie status during the firefight, proving himself under the most extreme combat conditions possible. His technical skills and courage under fire had earned him the respect of his teammates and demonstrated that he belonged among the elite warriors of the SEAL teams. The extraction helicopters faced no enemy fire as they landed in the valley, a stark contrast to the situation just hours earlier when the area had been swarming with Taliban fighters. The coordinated American assault had eliminated or scattered the enemy forces that had previously made helicopter operations impossible. During the flight back to their forward operating base, Lieutenant Morrison reflected on the mission that had tested every aspect of their training and experience. What had begun as a simple extraction operation had evolved into a complex intelligence gathering mission and finally into their participation in a major strike against enemy leadership. Mitchell treated the minor wounds that several team members had sustained during the firefight, grateful that none of her teammates had been seriously injured despite the overwhelming odds they had faced. The medical supplies she had carefully rationed during their isolation had proven adequate for their needs. Jackson reviewed the effectiveness of his improvised defensive measures, already thinking about how the lessons learned could be applied to future operations. The demolitions work that had helped save their lives would be incorporated into training programs for other special operations units. Williams compiled an after-action report documenting the tactical lessons learned during their 48 hours behind enemy lines. The experience would be studied by special operations trainers to improve preparation for similar situations that other teams might encounter. Thompson confirmed that their original target, the Taliban commander they had come to capture, was among the high-value individuals taken into custody during the operation. The mission objective had been achieved despite the dramatic changes in tactical situation and the near-impossible odds they had faced. As their helicopter crossed back into friendly territory, Marcus felt the exhaustion that adrenaline had kept at bay during their ordeal. The 8 SEALs had survived one of the most challenging special operations missions of the war, and their dedication to duty had contributed to a significant victory against Taliban forces. The ridgeline that had nearly become their grave had instead become the foundation for one of the most successful joint operations in recent memory. Their willingness to remain in position despite impossible odds had provided the intelligence necessary for a coordinated strike that would be remembered as a turning point in the campaign against Taliban leadership. The brotherhood forged during their desperate fight for survival would bind the 8 SEALs together for the rest of their lives, a testament to the courage and dedication that defined America's elite warriors in the mountains of Afghanistan.